Hollywood's golden age from the 1930s to the 1970s was not merely a film production machine but a global cultural empire where stars were not only performers on screen, but also ideological symbols, shaping how millions of people understood power, morality, and social order. Yet behind the bright stage lights, racial discrimination was gradually normalized, deeply embedded in films, backstage culture, and even the private lives of many stars. Some used their power to pressure actors of color, forcing them to remain silent and comply. Others removed them from projects simply for not being the right image. And some went even further, openly supporting the creation of exclusionary rules that turned inequality into protected systems. In today's video, we will break down 10 of the most racially discriminatory stars of classic Hollywood and confront the final question. Did any of them truly pay a price for what they did? 1. Jack Elam, meaning language and backstage power directed at actors of color. No, I was an auditor in the picture business, and because of an eye problem, I had to, get another job. From the late 1950s through the 1960s, when Western films dominated Hollywood, Jack Elam appeared on film sets across California, Arizona, and New Mexico. He was not an A-list star, but he was familiar enough to carry a level of informal authority that made people around him cautious. It was precisely within this backstage environment that, according to later published accounts and memoirs by crew members, Elam's racially biased attitudes became visible and recurring. According to the memoir of an assistant director who worked with Elam on a Western filmed in Arizona in 1961, a lone owl frequently used derogatory nicknames when referring to Mexican-American actors and Native American performers in the cast. These remarks were never made on camera, but openly voiced in rest areas between takes where there was no press and no studio leadership present. Elam treated this manner of speaking as casual locker room-style conversation, while those targeted rarely responded, knowing their careers depended entirely on a handful of minor supporting roles. By 1964, during the filming of another Western in New Mexico, a wardrobe department member recorded in a personal journal that Elam openly complained about a Native American actor being given additional dialogue. He argued that it diluted the focus of the story and made the film feel less authentic. Although framed in professional language, the target of the complaint and the context made clear Elam's discomfort with non-white performers receiving greater on-screen presence. By the late 1960s, as civil rights movements began influencing Hollywood, Elam's attitude showed no meaningful shift. During a lunch break on a film set near Monument Valley in 1968, a Mexican-American background actor later recalled Elam remarking that you have to watch everything you say now, implying that he could no longer speak as freely as before about ethnic groups. This comment, shared years later on a local television interview, revealed that Elam viewed social change as an inconvenience rather than something deserving respect. More importantly, Jack Elam's behavior extended beyond language. As a reliable character actor trusted by producers, he held informal influence in evaluating supporting cast members. Internal production notes indicate that Elam sometimes suggested removing or reducing the roles of actors of color whom he felt did not fit the tone of the film, despite no evidence of poor performance. Even when small in scale, such decisions directly affected the career opportunities of minority performers in an already exclusionary industry. What makes Elam's case particularly notable is that he never faced public backlash during the height of his career. There were no explosive interviews, no political declarations, only a pattern of repeated conduct sustained by collective silence. This subtle form of discrimination allowed Elam to blend seamlessly into Hollywood's golden era without leaving an obvious public record. Even though the impact on those in weaker positions was real, Jack Elam's story demonstrates that discrimination in Hollywood did not arise solely from overt statements, but was also sustained through everyday actions that were quiet, normalized, and difficult to challenge. From these seemingly minor behaviors, the narrative moves to a very different case, one in which discriminatory beliefs were no longer confined to the backstage, but openly expressed before a global audience. 2. John Wayne public statements supporting white leadership. More rights, but it isn't a thing where the rest of the country should feel terribly guilty about anything. Because they have. In the winter of 1971, inside a Los Angeles interview room, John Wayne sat down with Playboy magazine. Not as an actor nearing the end of his career, but with the confidence of a national icon. When journalist David Sheff asked about the growing equality movement in the United States, Wayne did not evade the question. He stated directly that he believed white people should retain leadership roles in society and that other communities needed to be properly educated before assuming power. The published response stunned readers, because it was not spoken impulsively, but articulated as a long-held personal belief. In the same interview, when asked about Native Americans, Wayne went further, asserting that land taken by white settlers was not the result of wrongdoing, but a natural outcome of a stronger people moving forward. He suggested that control belongs to those capable of holding it. Once printed nationwide, these statements sparked strong backlash while simultaneously reinforcing Wayne's image as a representative voice of deeply conservative American thought at the time. These 1971 remarks were consistent with how John Wayne had built his career over previous decades. From the late 1940s onward, he repeatedly selected and defended scripts that placed white characters at the moral center of the narrative. In The Searchers, filmed in 1956 at Monument Valley, Wayne's character spends much of the film pursuing Native Americans with undisguised hostility. While later critics would analyze the film as complex, at the time of its release, the portrayal strongly reinforced the idea that indigenous people were threats to be eliminated. Beyond the screen, Wayne expressed racially exclusionary views through political and professional involvement. During the 1950s, he was a prominent member of the Motion Picture Alliance, a conservative Hollywood organization that opposed progressive movements. CMUS resisted changes to the existing social order. According to meeting records released years later, Wayne complained that Hollywood was giving in too much to pressure from minority groups and warned that such changes would erode what he believed to be a white-centered concept of American identity. John Wayne's influence meant these views extended beyond personal opinion. As a top star, his stance could determine whether projects gained support or faced resistance within conservative filmmaking circles. Some producers later acknowledged that aligning with Wayne helped secure loyal audiences, while opposing him risked financial and distribution difficulties. After the Playboy interview was published, consequences emerged gradually rather than immediately. Several universities canceled film screenings or honorary recognitions, and civic organizations repeatedly cited Wayne's remarks whenever proposals arose to memorialize him. Despite this, Wayne never publicly apologized or retracted his statements. In a later interview with local media, he said he saw no reason to change his views simply because others disliked them. John Wayne's case represents an unapologetically public form of racial discrimination, articulated clearly from a position of maximum star power. This bluntness has made him one of the most controversial figures in American film history, and a reference point for examining how discriminatory beliefs can be expressed either openly or in later cases through far more subtle mechanisms. 3. Walt Disney turning racial bias into mass entertainment. There was no single explosive interview associated with Walt Disney, nor any impulsive statement that immediately ignited public outrage. Instead, the racially biased ideas connected to Disney emerged in a quieter and more enduring way through the near-absolute creative authority he held in Hollywood from the 1930s through the post-World War II era. For this reason, many film historians later argued that Disney's influence was in some ways deeper than that of openly extreme stars, because these biases were not spoken aloud but embedded into mass-market content, particularly material aimed at children. From the early 1930s onward, as the Disney Studio in Burbank, California, expanded large-scale production of animated shorts, characters representing Black individuals and other minority groups were frequently constructed using fixed stereotypes. They appeared with exaggerated physical features, stylized speech patterns, naive behavior, and roles designed solely for comic effect. These portrayals were not accidental. Surviving production records show that all major scripts and character designs passed through Walt Disney himself, who retained the authority to demand revisions if something did not align with what he considered the preferences of the core audience. The controversy reached its peak in 1946 when Song of the South premiered in Atlanta, a location symbolically tied to the American South. Although set in the post-slavery era, the film portrayed Black characters as gentle, cheerful figures closely attached to simple labor, almost entirely disconnected from the historical reality of oppression. Shortly after its release, the New York Times and several independent critics pointed out that the film blurred historical truth, transforming a painful period into a nostalgic and comforting narrative. Walt Disney, however, did not respond directly. He neither revised nor withdrew the film, allowing it to continue screening across multiple southern states where audiences embraced it as validation of their familiar view of the past. At the same time, allegations concerning a biased workplace environment began appearing in memoirs written by former Disney employees. Several artists who worked at the Burbank studio between 1940 and 1945 later recalled that exclusionary remarks regularly surfaced in informal conversations, particularly when discussing Jewish employees and immigrants. According to these accounts, Walt Disney did not publicly voice harsh statements himself, but he also did not intervene or correct such behavior, effectively fostering an environment where bias was normalized and left unchallenged. This silence continued for many years when movements advocating greater equality began to significantly influence American entertainment during the 1950s and 1960s. Disney still did not publicly reassess earlier works. Song of the South gradually became restricted from wide US release, yet it was never officially acknowledged as a mistake. The film came to exist as an avoided legacy, quietly set aside without explanation, a handling that led many scholars to conclude that Disney chose to protect the company's image rather than confront the issues reflected in the work. What makes Walt Disney's case particularly concerning is the nature of his audience. Unlike adult films or political commentary, Disney animation reached directly into the world of children, where critical judgment was still developing. Repeated exposure to stereotyped imagery over many years contributed to shaping how millions of young viewers perceived people different from themselves through a slow but persistent process. In this context, bias did not appear as open conflict or hostility, but as something wrapped in friendliness, humor, and family-friendly presentation. From here, the narrative moves to another phase of Hollywood's golden era, where charm and glamour on screen conceal deep contradictions between words, actions, and treatment of marginalized communities. 4. Clark Gable, the contradiction between progressive gestures and dismissive language. She can act sure, but she's still just a woman of color. This remark, recorded in the memoir of a crew member published in the late 1970s, is believed to have been spoken by Clark Gable during a private conversation in Culver City away from cameras, reporters, and public attention. It never appeared in the press at the time, but when recalled years later, it disrupted the image of Clark Gable as a progressive king of Hollywood that had long been cultivated. In 1939, on the set of Gone with the Wind, Clark Gable was the most powerful star in Hollywood. Every major decision had to account for his reaction. Within this context, his objection to Heidi McDaniel, the black actress who played Mammy, being barred from using shared restrooms with white actors, was widely praised by the media as a rare progressive act. According to coverage by the Los Angeles Times at the time, Gable threatened to leave the project if McDaniel continued to be treated under racially segregated regulations. Pressure from the film's biggest star forced the producers to concede. However, this public stance did not mean Clark Gable had abandoned personal bias. In backstage accounts published later, many black background actors recalled that Gable continued to use dismissive terms in private conversations, particularly when discussing the ability and professional standing of actors of color. These remarks were not openly hostile, but framed as professional evaluations, making them difficult to challenge while clearly reinforcing boundaries between white performers and others. This contradiction was further evident in how Gable exercised star power. Aside from the case involving Hattie McDaniel, he rarely spoke out against systemic discriminatory practices. He did not advocate for more leading roles for actors of color, nor did he participate in efforts to change how minority communities were portrayed in Hollywood. According to an investigative piece published years later in Ebony magazine, some black actors described Gable as polite when necessary, but unwilling to cross the line into genuinely supporting them. Even at private Hollywood gatherings in the 1940s, where there were no recordings or press presence, Gable was reportedly vocal in expressing frustration as studios began facing pressure to change their image. According to a veteran entertainment journalist interviewed on California local television in the 1980s, these complaints revealed that Gable viewed calls for equality as unnecessary interference in a system that had already granted him power and fame. The result of this contradiction is a dual legacy. Publicly, Clark Gable is remembered as someone who stood up for Hattie McDaniel. Privately, in the memories of many who worked with him, he remained a product of old Hollywood, where exclusion did not require slogans or public statements, but lived in judgments, language, and decisions about who deserved to stand at the center. Clark Gable, therefore, does not represent loud or extreme bias, but a more dangerous form where a single progressive gesture masks layers of unresolved attitudes. This pattern would continue to appear in later names in different forms that feel unsettlingly familiar. 5. Gary Cooper. Silence and conservatism in the face of excluding actors of color. In 1947, during a closed-door discussion between actors and producers in Los Angeles, the conversation turned to whether Hollywood should expand opportunities for actors of color in the post-war period. Gary Cooper offered a brief but decisive remark. According to notes later recorded by a journalist specializing in film industry backstage reporting, Cooper argued that the film industry should not move too far ahead of society, and that altering traditional role structures could risk alienating audiences. There were no insulting words and no direct attacks. But within the context of the time, this position effectively meant preserving a system in which white performers continue to occupy all central roles. Unlike John Wayne or Clark Gable, Gary Cooper did not rely on public statements to express his stance. His authority came from his image as the ideal American man, reserved, dependable, and morally upright, a figure respected by both the public and conservative political circles. As a result, whenever Cooper voiced opinions in internal meetings or professional organizations, his views were often treated as reasonable judgments rather than personal bias. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, as movements advocating greater equality began to place pressure on Hollywood, Cooper was an active member of the Motion Picture Alliance, an organization that brought together many conservative stars. According to documents later declassified, he frequently sided with opposition to introducing racial equality themes into films, arguing that cinema should reflect current society rather than attempt to change it. While this reasoning appeared neutral on the surface, it effectively helped sustain the exclusion of actors of color from roles with depth and influence. On film sets, Gary Cooper's discriminatory impact was most evident through what he chose not to do. According to memoirs by several Mexican supporting actors who worked with him on a California-based production in 1952, when their roles were reduced or removed without clear explanation, Cooper was consulted in his capacity as the leading star. He neither objected nor intervened, quietly accepting the producer's decisions. In an environment where star power could alter outcomes, this silence functioned as tacit approval of excluding non-white performers. Even in television interviews in the early 1950s, when asked about emerging social movements, Cooper maintained a calm but firm tone. He emphasized his belief in traditional values and stated that Hollywood should not be drawn into social controversy. For many viewers, this came across as maturity and restraint. For communities seeking change, however, it was a clear signal that doors remained firmly closed. Backstage rumors surrounding Gary Cooper during this period reflected the same pattern. Some entertainment writers later suggested that Cooper feared expanding opportunities for actors of color would weaken the conservative image of America he represented on screen. While there is no evidence that he directly insulted or targeted individuals, his repeated alignment with preserving the existing order produced long-lasting consequences, as many opportunities were halted at the discussion stage. This form of discrimination, rarely criticized and often overlooked, proved to be among the most enduring, setting the stage for the next figures, where exclusion would take more visible, direct, and difficult to deny forms. 6. Errol Flynn. Disregard toward indigenous performers and actors of color. In June 1938, at a temporary filming camp along the California coast, the production of The Adventures of Robin Hood entered its peak shooting period. Errol Flynn was at the height of his fame, one of Hollywood's most celebrated adventure stars with the privilege to arrive late, revise dialogue, and request changes to scene staging. Within this near-absolute power, according to later accounts from crew members, Flynn's treatment of those outside the white acting circle revealed a clear pattern of exclusionary attitudes. In a memoir published in the early 1970s by a production assistant who had accompanied Flynn on shoots in the Caribbean and South America, the author recalled that Flynn frequently referred to indigenous performers using belittling nicknames rather than their real names, even when they held recurring roles. These terms were never used on camera, but spoken in rest areas when Flynn addressed directors or close colleagues. According to the account, Flynn considered this behavior harmless. Yet, for the indigenous actors involved, being addressed by nicknames instead of their names was a clear sign they were not regarded as equal colleagues. By the early 1940s, as Flynn took part in productions filmed abroad, particularly projects requiring large numbers of local background performers, this attitude became even more pronounced. During a film shot in Mexico in 1942, backstage documents recorded Flynn repeatedly complaining about the disorganization of local performers despite the underlying issues stemming from inconsistent scheduling by the American production team. A lighting crew member later recalled Flynn asking the director to limit direct communication with indigenous actors, suggesting they should simply stand in place and follow instructions, language that framed them as set elements rather than individuals with agency. This disregard extended beyond words. As the lead star, Flynn held real influence over how supporting performers were used. Records indicate that in large crowd scenes, he requested reduced screen time for actors of color or indigenous performers, citing concerns that they might distract from the main character. When such suggestions came from a box office draw, they were often accepted without debate, resulting in lost opportunities for recognition and career advancement. Backstage rumors surrounding Errol Flynn further darkened the picture. Between 1943 and 1945, several entertainment journalists in Los Angeles hinted that Flynn showed particular disrespect toward indigenous performers during overseas shoots, treating them as part of an exotic experience that enhanced his adventurous image. While these reports lacked detail at the time, later memoirs confirmed that Flynn's arrogance was not limited to studio executives or producers, but extended to the most vulnerable members of film crews. Notably, Errol Flynn was never forced to publicly confront these behaviors during his peak years. His image as a charming, adventurous, and carefree star proved too compelling for audiences, allowing backstage accounts to be dismissed or minimized as mere star temperament. This tolerance enabled a form of exclusion rooted in colonial attitudes to persist, concealed beneath glamour and romantic adventure films. From a celebrated adventure icon on screen, the narrative now moves to another figure where exclusion is no longer tied to personal arrogance, but to political authority and far-reaching social influence. 8. Humphrey Bogart. Controversial remarks in the early years of his career. Not on screen, but in the closed-off spaces of early 1930s Hollywood, Humphrey Bogart began to reveal another side of himself. At the time, he was not yet a cinematic icon, but a supporting actor moving from one studio lot to another in Los Angeles, frequently gathering in bars around the Sunset Strip with fellow actors and crew members. According to memoirs by several colleagues published years later, it was during these private conversations that Bogart repeatedly used dismissive language when referring to Asian and Latin American people. Behind-the-scenes accounts indicate that Bogart often employed belittling terms when complaining about Latin American actors in large crowd scenes, arguing that they slowed down production or were unnecessary for the frame. These remarks were made in a context where power overwhelmingly favored white actors, leaving those being spoken about with little ability to respond or challenge such attitudes. During a film project shot in California in 1939, according to the personal diary of a production assistant, Bogart openly expressed frustration when the crew had to work alongside Asian actors for a sequence involving an international setting. He argued that their presence did not serve the story, a claim framed as a professional concern, but one that effectively excluded an entire group from the shared workspace. The final decision was to reduce the screen time of those roles, an outcome that demonstrated how Bogart's words, though not made publicly, still carried a certain weight. Notably, these actions led to no immediate consequences at the time. Hollywood then regarded such remarks as commonplace, especially when they came from a male actor striving to secure his position in the industry. Only many years later, after Bogart had become a symbol of toughness and integrity on screen, did memoirs and production records resurface, revealing a shadowed chapter in the early phase of his career. Bogart's later shift in position when he publicly supported progressive social causes does not erase the reality that he had once been part of an environment that normalized exclusionary language and attitudes. Those early remarks are therefore still seen as an unavoidable trace in his legacy, reflecting how racial bias was treated as ordinary in the Hollywood industry at the time he entered it. From discreet conversations in bars, the narrative now moves to a figure whose exclusionary views did not remain behind the scenes, but were carried into organizational decisions and formal power. 9. Ronald Reagan prioritizing white interests from Hollywood to politics. Ronald Reagan's power in Hollywood did not come from his roles on screen, but from his leadership positions. As president of the Screen Actors Guild in the late 1940s, Reagan held direct influence over professional policies, including how the industry treated actors of color. According to meeting records released later, Reagan repeatedly opposed proposals aimed at expanding opportunities for groups that had long been excluded. In union meetings in Los Angeles between 1947 and 1951, Reagan was documented arguing that intervention to promote equality was unnecessary and could destabilize the industry. Although framed in managerial language, this position directly targeted initiatives designed to provide larger roles and better working conditions for actors of color. By refusing to support these proposals, Reagan effectively helped preserve a structure in which white actors continued to hold overwhelming advantage. This mindset did not remain confined to union meeting rooms. It was also reflected in Reagan's broader approach to social issues. In speeches and private discussions toward the end of his acting career, He frequently emphasized opposition to policies promoting equality, which he viewed as excessive interference in traditional social order. These views did not take the form of direct attacks, but they denied the need for change sought by marginalized communities. When Reagan left Hollywood and entered politics, these positions did not disappear. Instead, they were translated into clearer political stances, with influence far beyond the entertainment industry. Later, historians have pointed out that the worldview shaped within a conservative Hollywood environment followed Reagan into policy decisions where issues of equality were consistently placed behind stability and traditional values. The controversies surrounding Reagan, therefore, are not merely the story of an actor who changed careers. They illustrate how racial bias can be maintained and reinforced through institutional power without harsh language, but through systemic decisions. When a former head of an actors union chose to defend the existing order, the consequences extended beyond professional opportunities for a single group and rippled through society for decades afterward. With Ronald Reagan, the picture of racial bias in Hollywood's golden age reached its highest level of authority, where attitudes formed behind the scenes were ultimately carried into the public arena of politics, leaving a lasting imprint. Hollywood's golden age created enduring icons, but it also left behind shadows that for decades few were willing to confront. As the glamour fades, remarks, actions, and decisions once considered normal reveal the scale of their influence and consequences, not only for those directly affected, but for an entire global culture. Confronting this history is not about erasing the past, but about understanding the cost of power when it is not accompanied by responsibility. If you have other thoughts, perspectives, or discoveries about the figures discussed in this video, feel free to leave a comment below so we can continue the discussion. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on future videos where we will keep examining behind-the-scenes stories that few have dared to bring into the open.